morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this talk. In this talk today, we'll be discussing about the issue of leadership at sea and why in this era it's so important. So leadership involves a wide range of skills, and while there became cases of, let's say, born leaders, it is widely assumed that leadership is something that can be taught. So leadership skills can help crew members at many levels take initiatives, to be motivated, to face onboard challenges, to perform at their best. So it's a matter of inspiring other people, of course, assisting in the works to be done, and so on and so forth. So overall, knowing how to lead effectively is essential to every mariner, and of course to every executive across the globe, in order to maximize not only the performance but also optimize any sort of operational policies, procedures, values, any sort of operational excellence any organization may let's say aiming to achieve. So in this talk, we have with us Gerardo Borromeo. Gerardo is the Chief Executive Officer of PCT Holdings Corporation. Mark Bull, who is Director of Trafalgar Navigation, and Captain Parani. Parani is the HSS EQ Manager of Tafton Asset Management. I would like to also state that Parani is the author of the Golden Stripes, Leaders from the High Seas. It's a very fine book. I would like to comment on that, and of course we'd like to hear from Parani on his book. It's a fantastic book written from a mariner for mariners, and also Mark is extensively authoring a number of issues. So I would like to welcome you all on board. I would like to thank you for taking the time, and I'd like to ask you to briefly introduce yourselves, starting with Dito.
Thank you very much, Apo, and thank you for inviting me this afternoon to participate in this talk. As you had already introduced, I go by Gerardo Borromeo. Most people call me Dito. I serve as the Chief Executive of the Philippine Transmarine Carriers Group based in Manila. We're a 42-year-old organization and have had the opportunity to serve the world through the Filipino people who serve on various kinds of ships. I think the issue of leadership is a very interesting one because while we say that the industry has been around forever, it's not so much as our past, but the future. How do we invite the best and brightest of the next generation of global maritime professionals to participate in this industry? And how do we prepare them for what lies ahead? And as we have seen in the last 12 months, what we thought was a normal situation has become completely abnormal, and the world has turned upside down. What kind of qualities of leadership are we going to need in the future, and how do we develop those skills? How do we find those skills? How do we identify them early on? And how do we prepare ourselves to be able to deal with many unknown unknowns? And so these are good questions to ask, and I look forward to a very interactive session to learn as much as I can share. Thank you.
Thank you, Dito. Parani?
Thanks for the invite, Apostolo, and it's an honor to be here with the other panelists. I think the issue of maritime leadership requires a lot of discussion and awareness, and I'm thankful that you've brought this topic up. Shipping is such a safety-critical industry, and my opinion is that all failures at sea are at some level or the other failures of leadership. And we do need to bring about the awareness for seafarers so that they can self-study or with the guidance of other material, improve their own chances of safety and success at sea. Thank you.
Okay. Mark?
Hello to everyone. My name's Mark Bull. I'm presently a marine consultant. My career spans 50 years, 27 years at sea, and then the following 23 ashore. And I feel like a Grand Prix driver just passing the pits, and they've come out with the board saying last lap. And I hope to retire fairly soon, but I'm enjoying what I do. The subject of leadership I find very interesting. And when I went to sea, one of my role models was Captain Cook. And in the days when he sailed around the world on his voyages of exploration was the days that the Royal Navy sent teams ashore to the pubs to drag people onto the ships. They were called the press gangs. And yet Captain Cook had this fame of all the people who sailed with him volunteered, quite simply because he realized for a successful outcome, he needed a collaborative crew with him. The same applies today. If you're going to make that ship work, you have to lead and encourage and motivate your crew. And my hat goes off to all those masters and chief engineers on board ships in the last 18 months, how they've held it all together. They really displayed good leadership. Thanks.
Okay. Now, I'd like to ask, to start our discussion, I'd like to ask all of you, if you could, let's say, try and define leadership for those on board, of course, ashore. So how should we approach and how should we define leadership? Dito?
You know, leadership is in one way, a simple word, but it's a very complex concept. And I think you can try to define leadership in terms of an ability to give directions. But the ability to give directions has to start with the individual. Does that individual command a certain presence in order to be able to get people to listen and understand? Is that person also able to listen? Because it's very important for that person to listen, to be situationally aware, and to be able to think in terms that are not normal, because the issue of leadership is best tested under complex and difficult times, as Mark has just suggested, if you look back at the last 20 years. It's easy to say, let's go left or let's go right. But to be able to get people to do left or to do right in very difficult and trying circumstances is when you need the best of an individual who can not only command presence, but share the confidence and the persona that that individual has been able to build over time. So how do we get people to actually lead? How do we get people to actually guide? And how do you get people to actually teach? And so I think that a good leader starts by being a good follower, a good listener. And so therefore, leadership is a quality that is a synthesis of all of the elements that makes a person whole, and shows up in the ability for a person to not only show respect and show concern, but in effect, be able to get people to act on an idea, an action, or a need.
Thank you, Dito. Parani, your thoughts?
I think all of us instinctively, we recognize a good leader when we see one, and we understand what good leadership is. And it's not so easy to define, but I will try to do so, especially in the maritime context. I would define leadership as an intentional, higher standard of conduct, which also influences a higher standard of conduct in others around us towards a positive outcome. A positive outcome in the maritime context is, of course, that the ships continue to run safely and efficiently. And the way we practice leadership, we can call it an art, we can call it a science, we can call it a mindset, and all of them would apply. And like you said earlier, for sure, leadership can be learned and improved with practice. So if we go with, yes.
Sorry.
So if we go with this definition, I would say that every maritime professional, every seafarer is a leader on board.
Okay. Mark, your take on how should we define leadership?
Yes, I mean, basically, it's the ability to motivate the people, the crew, to achieve the common goal, which is to get the ship to arrive safely at each and every port and deliver the cargo in good condition. And a complex series of activities are required to do that. And of course, there are many factors to take into account, not least of which is that the sea is a hostile environment, and all that puts pressure on the leaders.
Okay. So my next one would be, I would like to ask you to comment on what sort of skills are evident or required from, let's say, a great leader. What do you think about that, Tito?
I guess we should start with somebody knowing their capability and having the level of confidence to exude a certain presence. As Parami mentioned, if you can inspire and you can, at the worst of times, get people's attentions, then you can at least provide guidance. In addition to that, I think that a leader has to have the ability to get a sense and a feel for the situation around them, because they cannot act by themselves. They have a responsibility to be able to move people to action. And so situational awareness and the ability to communicate and the ability to guide and influence are all critical. And it might be easy enough to say, look, I can convince people to do something. Under typical circumstances, calm circumstances, that may be the case. But under duress and under difficult situations, that is where leadership really stands out, because you're then put under a pressure situation where you have to perform equally as well, but where time, you may not have the luxury of time to be able to convince people. So therefore, the buildup of your presence and the buildup of that capability, so that at a moment's notice, I think Mark gave the example of Captain Cook, that reputation then precedes you. And when you have that reputation, all of a sudden people coming on board to join your group already know ahead of time that there is a certain environment and a certain expectation on behavior. And that in itself allows you to be able to mold and shape the outcome much more readily.
Okay, Parami?
I think there are several major and minor skills required for leadership. But if I were to pick the top 5, I would start with expertise. And I believe that all leaders at sea need to be experts and have a very good grasp of the knowledge for the job to start becoming a leader. And number 2, I would say, is lead by example. This requires a lot of self-analysis and mindfulness, but also it requires that a leader is organized, is hardworking and passionate. Third, I would say, is communication skills. Every opportunity to communicate is an opportunity to lead and to influence and inspire. The fourth, I would say, is a growth mindset, in the sense the leader needs to not just create followers, but also need to create leaders, so that they don't have just yes men around them, but they have a strong team who can contribute towards the positive outcome. And lastly, but not least, the leader needs to be decisive, because all the leadership skill ultimately boils down to the decisions that we make.
Okay, Mark?
Yes, well, basically both Dito and Parani have mentioned some of these key skills that a leader requires. So I would like to emphasize you must be a good listener, and you must be good at encouraging people to communicate with you. Because if you're not hearing all the problems, then it's going to cause you problems in achieving this common goal. But if I would like to add one thing that has to what has been said already, it is the ability to know when to say no. The time has come when I'm not going to go beyond this line and that's it. I'm the leader, my decision, we stop here right now. It's very difficult, because as soon as you do that, you are criticized from all sides. You're accused of cowardice, or but Captain XYZ managed to get in with only one tug, or you know, the other chief engineer managed to run on this type of fuel, etc. What's your problem? Well, we've got our individual red lines and that's it, and you must know where they are. Another thing, and especially in our case seagoing, is we must be comfortable with uncertainty. We may not have all the information we need to make a really good, firm decision. So we must somehow continue, perhaps on the safe side, until we have sufficient information to make that final decisive decision. Definitely encouraging others, passing on some authority, delegating jobs, gives satisfaction to the people, so they are then more willing to collaborate with you.
Okay, thank you for bringing these ideas to the table. In many occasions, I think that the Bible of leadership of the 20th century is a book by John C. Maxwell, famous American author, with his book on 21 irrefutable laws of leadership. So, which is more or less describing what we also said here as well, the idea of a leader, etc. Now, given that the people stay pursuing a career at sea at, let's say, intervals or maybe paths that, let's say, tend to minimize. I mean, if we see how many years people stay at sea compared to 20 or maybe 10 years ago, it's getting less and less. Now, my question is, how do we, let's say, embrace leadership skills to these people? Are we happy with the leadership skills that they do have? How could we, let's say, as an industry, prepare these leaders? Because it's not happening from one day to the other. I'm asking you to give me your ideas of how you think, is it successful what we're doing so far? I mean, I'm not going to say any sort of names. I'm just saying as an industry, are we happy with what we do at the time? How should we develop these leadership skills? Vito.
You always come up with such interesting, thought-provoking questions. But if I were to compare, and we talk of leadership, not just in terms of people who work at sea, but leaders in general. And if I look at different industries, for example, oftentimes I hear this comment that the academic institutions do not prepare the graduates for what is expected of them when they hit the ground. So perhaps what that suggests is that if we look at how we mold and shape our future key leaders, there's got to be a stronger industry academic linkage in order for us to bring the situations, the complex situations, into the classroom, in order for people to begin to appreciate what would be expected of them, so that early on they can already mold the mindset, as has been suggested, the skill set, as has been suggested, but more importantly, to be able to anticipate the types of situations where the best of an individual's performance comes out. And you don't have to be the number one to be a leader. As Mark has suggested, we can all be leaders in our own respect because we know our place under the sun. But you can only be ready if you are exposed to that. So the more exposure industry can give to the pipeline of people coming through from high school to college to university, or even through an apprenticeship program, I think the better the output will be. And the closer the linkage is between industry and either the academic and training institutions, the more comfortable industry will be in terms of the expectations of people coming through, because that means we can get people who are almost ready to run sooner. That's really part of the shipboard training. So how can we get shipboard training done ahead of time so that we have as seamless a learning experience as possible?
Okay, Rani?
Yes, to start with your first question, how are we doing in terms of leadership right now? I think seafaring as a profession, we learn a lot of things at an early age and we get humbled by the sea. So we do have, I mean, all these seafarers who are on the ships, I would say they are all very good leaders. And they have shown this, even like Mark and Dito mentioned earlier, they have shown their leadership over the last year and the resilience during this pandemic. Having said that, I would say that there is always room to improve, as is evident by all the accidents that we see happening around us. And I connect that with what I said earlier, that all failures are at some level or the other failures of leadership. So yes, there is room to improve. And as an industry, I don't think we have been very intentional about it so far. Only over the last few years, we have this leadership training in the STCW, and that is limited to some short courses, all crunched together, and then there is not much talk about it at sea. So to start with, how can we go about it? First of all, we need to be good role models ourselves, and number two is to create awareness and to have more such discussions about leadership.
Okay, Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. I undertook my first leadership and management training in 1973 as a cadet, midway through the first phase. And I remember the lecturer as a Commander Southcott, and he exuded leadership. So we had some really good points. And one of the things that I remember taking forward with me was, remember the things or the leaders that you thought were really good, and what did they do? And discard the ones that were not very good at it. And that is what I've accumulated all the way through. But if I was taking this subject today, I would adopt a similar thing, but to reinforce it, rather than have a structured formal lectures, would be something like a seminar, rather like many companies have, where they get all their captains together and the chief engineers, and they have an open seminar discussing things, where issues about certain problems of leadership, etc., can be discussed with peers, and then people can go away and put sort of new ideas into practice. Formalizing it too much, I don't know that it's such a good idea, because you go on the internet and you type in leadership, and there's everybody who's probably not even led a dog for a walk telling us how to conduct leadership. No, thank you. I will stick with my captains and chief engineers. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a tendency, especially if you go to the social media and the internet in these days, from people to learn from some, buzzwords or some, stuff like that. It's exactly what you said. But in real life, the reality can teach us in a much better way. So I would like to then further dig into what we discussed, and I would like to ask, how should we improve? We have this human element, leadership, management, etc. We have this STCW requirement, but other than that, we do understand it's not about teaching leadership. They have to apply the skills, and even if you go to let's say older models, talking about competency or maybe talking about performance has to do with competency and motivation. Motivation is one thing, and you all said leaders have to be able to motivate their people, otherwise they cannot lead them. Leadership has to do with people. You all said that. It's not about being myself alone in a room. I'm not a leader of myself. I have to lead other people. So it's about people. You have to listen, etc. So, but when it comes to competency, it's about the knowledge, and knowledge has to do with seminars. It's about the skills, and skills have to do with what you do on a day-to-day basis, but it's also about attitude. So I would like to ask you, how should we, let's say, improve, refine, enhance the ways that we develop the leaders we have in the industry? Dito, where exactly do you see room for improvement specifically?
If we're going to talk about leaders within the context of the maritime industry, and we're talking about the maritime industry, then the first thing that we probably need to do is ensure that their body of knowledge is as deep as possible in order for them to be both functionally and technically literate to make a decision. This is a key component. that means it goes back to the industry academic linkage. How do we bring what happens on board and simulate that in different ways, sort of like a critical conditions training where we can simulate behavior, we can simulate people's interactions, and we can simulate problems that we have seen. And there is a whole body of knowledge of problems that go on board, and most particularly in terms of bridge team management, for example. And these are examples where, as you teach knowledge, you then teach the ability to deal with problems and issues. And the hoped outcome of all of that are people's behaviors and people's approaches to problem solving, which in effect gives them the confidence level to now then carry out the leadership or the problem solving, if you will. So let us further expose the academic part of the whole training to life on board in ways that you don't necessarily have to go to see. We can simulate a lot of that, and we then simulate and break down people's behaviors, the way people problem solve. And from there, one gets the confidence to be able to know that they can communicate effectively. And most importantly, they need to know how to communicate, because if they cannot communicate ideas, perspectives, or actions, then no matter how good and competent they are, they're never going to be able to get the heart and soul of people to be able to move them, especially in critical situations.
Okay. Parani?
Yes, actually, I want to pick up from where Mark left off about the role models at sea. I think I also sailed for 14 plus years at sea, and another 14 ashore now. And we see a lot of good role models, and we see, we see certain behaviors that we want to avoid as well. But then again, shipping is such a safety critical industry. All of us may not be as lucky to have gone through all this learning, without an accident. So it's better to have this learning early on, so we know what are the, let's say, the constructive behaviors, and then those that we have to avoid. So for that, along with practical, let's say practical sea experience and observing role models, we also need to have some sort of formal education, which is built into the either the formal STCW or informal process. So we need some structured education to highlight, to make seafarers aware of the areas that or the skills that are required, and to have more such discussions, not only like we have today, but we need more such discussions at the company level, and on the ship we need to have discussions about leadership.
Okay, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's one where we have to perhaps in pre-voyage briefings to bring our masters and chief engineers to a side and tell them that, we would like you to go out there and start identifying people, start supporting them, and especially mentoring. Mentoring is a really important skill on board ships. It can be brief, etc. Certainly in my own case, I remember all the way back to the days of a cadet, I can recall the people who mentored me. There's these good tips and tricks. And above all, a leader at sea has got to be firm but fair. As Parani said, there are times when you have to say, that's it, no further time for discussion, we must do this now. And if you have been looking after your team and motivating, they will respond to you. So again, it's under the times of stress and difficulty that you can really determine how well your leadership has worked, because people will respond without you issuing even a single order. And that has to be translated into the office as well, because the people charged with the responsibility in the office have to show the empathy to the people on the ships and understand the problems they are going through, again, be able to listen, not be too quick to judge until they have all the details in to decide about an incident or an occurrence on board the ship. And again, continually support and motivate the shipboard staff.
Okay, now I would like to ask, I think Parani mentioned it as he was speaking earlier, whose responsibility is it? Because at some point, I've said the case of the minimizing career length at sea for all those people working, starting with the ships and then coming ashore. But whose responsibility is it? Because at some point, it's not the responsibility of the maritime academies, because yes, they would have, let's say, a couple of courses or seminars, and maybe that's it. So whose responsibility is it to develop these leadership skills? And how should we approach that in real life?
We look at the shipping industry as an asset-heavy industry, and that it's all about the ship and it's all about operating a ship. Let's take the view that at the end of the day, the shipping industry is a people industry. You have the tonnage providers, who are all the ship owners who spend billions and billions of dollars to have the assets. But without the tonnage enablers, who are the people, the heart and soul of shipping, those ships are not going to move efficiently. So if that is the case, then we deal with shipping as a human resource development environment. And whatever we do on shore for our own staff, for the development of careers, we must also bring to the ship. The fact that maybe most seafarers, most maritime professionals are contractual in nature should not change the fact that we bring a human resource element to training and development, so that the output, the skill levels, and everything that we talk about today will come out. That is ultimately the responsibility of all ship owners, ship operators, ship managers, and crew managers. And that what industry needs to be linked with academia in order to have a seamless pipeline, so that you develop the basic skills early on, and we continue to refine them as they go through and go on board, because a career is never done. A career is just a continuing phase. And at some point in time, when an individual no longer wants to work at sea, there is room for them to go into the shipping industry. So our mindset should be, let us develop people for the shipping industry, not just for a career at sea, because the shipping industry moves the world and there are so many different aspects to it. But you need to understand the basic elements of what makes this shipping industry function and succeed. And it is its people. And so therefore we cannot devoid ourselves from the responsibility of developing people in the different aspects that make this industry what it is.
Okay, Parani?
Well, I go back to what I said, I think already a couple of times now, that all accidents at sea are at some level or the other failures of leadership. Now, who are all the stakeholders who are involved and whose interest it is in not to have accidents? It's the ship owner, it's the manager, it's the flag and the seafarer supplying nation, and last but not least, the seafarer himself or herself. So all these stakeholders need to invest in leadership. So I'll actually make a slightly controversial, maybe controversial statement, that first of all, the seafarer themselves need to take interest in developing their own leadership skills. So that so it should start from there, because you can show the way, but each person has to walk that way. So the interest has to come from within.
Yeah.
And of course, then the managers and the owners, they have to enable and empower and educate the seafarers, and they have to help them along that path, because it's the common goal of keeping the ship safe. And and it will also help seafarer retention and engagement.
Okay, Mark?
It all starts at the very top, and basically any good leader needs to find what I would call a hook, something to hook into somebody to make him, he's with me. And I'll tell you a short story here. I was going on board a ship in Northern Europe to carry out an assessment, And as we say, a good inspector knows by the time he's reached the top of the gangway what he's going to find. And I thought there is something really different about this ship. It's more like a passenger ship instead of a busy chemical tanker. The crew on deck were in what I call the Gucci of safety equipment. They're bright, shiny boiler suits, designer sort of safety glasses and the head, etc. And it just continued as we went back to the accommodation, spotlessly clean, etc. Something very, very different. And I eventually found the answer on the notice board in the mess room. And it was a letter from the chairman of the company directed at every crew member on board. And he stated that they'd made so many regular standing home allotments during the previous calendar year, so many special home allotments. And he said, and by my pen, if you want any more, you only have to ask for them. That ship had vetting inspections with 0 deficiencies, port state control, where the inspectors are speaking to the chief mate like he's their old friend, etc. That owner got payback for the way that he treated his people. And that is really a really good example of what a good leader is. It didn't cost him anything more than a letter, for goodness sake, but he made it work.
Yeah.
So my recommendation is that a good leader try something to really motivate the crew. It could be quite a minor detail, but all of a sudden they see you care for them, they will follow you, they will listen to you, and they will communicate with you, which is the key thing that you want.
Okay. May I ask, how do you see the way that we treat people? Because it's an issue, and I cannot agree more with what you said. How has the way we treat people, how we attract them to the industry, how we retain them, how we train them, how we develop them, how we empower them, and so on and so forth, has changed over the course of the last 20 years. And I would ask you to look forward in the next 20 years, let's say, take your crystal ball. What do you see as the industry moves forward? What are we going to see? Tito. A lot of people,
always very interesting and potentially controversial questions, but they're good ones. I mean, and if we start with what Parani mentioned about, has to start with the individual themselves. I think for very, very long, the industry has suffered from various elements in its operating cost that has forced it to try to think outside the box, which has actually led to looking for a different type of individual, resulting in a multicultural crew. A lot of it is cost driven. But if the whole intention is to find the cheapest crew, we're not going to necessarily find the best crew. But oftentimes there is this discussion, I need to find the cheapest crew. Well, you get cheap crew, you get what you want. So I think we need to turn that around. And now when you put it and juxtapose it against the question, what do we need in the next 20 years? Well, if historically we needed able-bodied seafarers, which had the brawn from the neck down, in the future, we are going to be driven by individuals from the neck up, because the complex systems that are going to be running vessels are going to drive more automation. And so therefore, the kind of education that will be needed for the people to be outstanding will require a better understanding of math, science, and engineering. And that's just a natural consequence of the doubling of computer power every 18 months. So if that's the case, looking forward, we need to be able to build the future global maritime professional in terms of the ability to understand complex systems and operate complexity in a very autonomous environment. I don't know that necessarily ships will become completely unmanned. They'll become more autonomous. We've already seen how more productivity is occurring with the behemoths growing and the same number of crew still being able to run these vessels. But that being the case, again, I go back to industry academic linkages, because we're going to be competing with other industries who are going to look for the same kind of people from the neck up, people who are going to be driven by an understanding of digital environments. How do we attract them? We have to have the role models that both Parani and Mark have talked about. We have to build the case for captains and engineers who can stand proud with their uniforms, similar to the way the aviation industry sells aviators or the military sells aviators. If we don't do that, we will be missing out on an opportunity to bring people to an industry that moves the world. What is has been very undersold is the fact that not only do these people earn as much money as aviation professionals, but let's look at the value added that these people have when you compare the value of goods and services that are moved by the industry and divided by the heads that participate. It's an immense number, and that cannot be undersold. I mean, if we sell that, then we'll get the right kind of people.
Yeah. I would also like to add at this point, we were having a discussion on Friday about the commercial implications of this incident in Suez Canal. We expect the ship will be refloated and so on and so forth. I'm just saying, the industry expects that this would be the most expensive, let's say, claim-wise, incident we have so far until the next one. As we move forward, ships are going to be more expensive. The value of goods to be transported is going to be increased, meaning we're going to have huge, let's say, in financial, huge assets, and we need the people to stay up to that level. And I cannot agree more with what you said, Vito, because as we look forward, we have to adjust for that. Okay, we have to adjust. We cannot, because it's what you said, we are not, a people-to-people industry, we're people-to-business. But at some point, we're not the aviation, but at some point, we expect people to move these assets around, and we have to prepare them accordingly. Parani, your thoughts on as we look forward, how should the industry, change the way we see things? What do you think?
Yes, I mean, I always like to say that the best way to predict the future is to create it. So for the future leaders of tomorrow, we need to start preparing and creating the future leaders of tomorrow today. And this, like we discussed earlier also, we need to create awareness, be role models, do mentoring, and we need to do all these things to create the future leaders. Yes, the technical skills will change. Let's say, there was, I learned Morse when I was studying for my third mates. Now we need to learn about GMDs and ECDIS and so on. So the technical skills will, of course, change. But in terms of leadership, let's say the future leaders will still need to be role models. They will need to have the capability for self-analysis. They will still need to communicate. They will still need to inspire their team. They will still need to be decisive in the face of, even with incomplete data. So they will need, the leadership skills will more or less remain the same, as it has been for thousands of years. So we need to start investing in the more in these leadership skills, so we have better leaders tomorrow.
I have to provoke you a little bit, because if we go back, let's say, we talked about leadership skills are going to be more or less the same. If we go back, let's say 30 or 40 years, a leader was someone who was instructing people. You have to do this, and you have to obey my orders, and so on and so forth. That's an old-fashioned model. Today, leaders have to be more compassionate, and as Mark correctly pointed out, is one of the quotes I have over here in my office. Leadership is about, communication is about listening, not talking, but listening. So, do you insist that, leadership skills are going to be the same in the next 20, 30 years? This is your projection, let's say. What do you think?
Yes. See, you're right in that sense that what has happened is, we have had the seafarers now are more skilled than they were, so they are highly technical people. And when there is a change in that sense of, each one is a specialist. So then the nature of leadership evolves towards being more democratic. So except of course in emergency situations where, you have to, it's a linear path. But then during normal operations, it's more democratic. But again, I guess this has always been the case, because with people who are more skilled, the relationship has been different. And when there has been an emergency, again, the pattern of leadership has more or less been the same. So, so the answer is yes or no. It's evolved in a certain bit, but less the dynamics in that situation pertaining to a typical situation have remained the same.
Okay, I'm just asking that because you know, a captain who is, let's say, state of the art, let's say, top notch, top tier quality, etc., being 40 years of age in 20 years time, he or she is 20 years now, 20 years old now. So we have to prepare them for what they're going to see in the future. Mark, your take on what we expect to see in the future, and how should we prepare them for the future?
Well, quite obviously, ships will become even more automated. You know, if I wanted to make all the ships autonomous tomorrow, it wouldn't happen. It's going to take years. So we have this big gap in between where we are working towards that, and during which time the various components of automation will have to be tested by human beings. So what I see more will take over is there will be more forward thinking, more forward planning. Some activities that are currently undertaken on board will be undertaken by special shore teams. So the numbers of people on board a ship will reduce, but we will have, for example, shore maintenance teams. I foresee that we will have standard ship models, rather like we have standard aircraft with a reduced number of types, etc. Similar layouts on the navigation bridge and so on. But perhaps the thing that I really see changing will be the change in safety management. And at the moment we are looking in the rear view mirror. And I know that we talk about leading indicators. No, put that in the bin. I'm talking about focusing on those margins of safety that we are able to see real time in the office. And we will get the alarm in the office and say, we need to intervene here, and say, you are getting too close to the shore, Captain. Where are you going? You know, there is no excuse going close to Mauritius for a mobile phone call. That type of thing. And it could be parameters on a main engine where the office are getting in touch with the chief engineer. And may I say that technology already exists inside containers.
Yeah.
So they can monitor all these refrigerated containers and realize when something is going outside. That is where I see the major change, and that will have a big effect on the leadership on board. So reduced number of people, definitely a lot more technically prepared and educated. And let's see.
Okay. May I ask now, in terms of where we stand with how we prepare these leaders, are there any lessons to be learned either from the past or from other industries, or maybe best practices? Because Vito mentioned the aviation. Arani mentioned it's a safety-intensive industry, and safety-intensive industries, it could be offshore, it could be oil and gas, it could be the nuclear, the petrochemical, it could be the aviation, of course, it could be the space. Any sort of best practices or lessons to be learned, Vito, from others? We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
No, but I guess we look at it from two perspectives. You know, a vessel has a life of 20, 25 years. And the people who are currently on board are probably going to be there for a considerable amount of time, only to be replaced by better people who come along. But we need to keep thinking about the future. And this is what both Mark and Arani are talking about. And so if we think about the future, then what's most important is how the industry will influence the way education is carried out in order to be able to carve out in the minds of the next generation that there is this industry that is attracting equally the best and brightest of people coming out. The only difference is that you might not work in an office, but you're going to be working in a mobile office. A mobile office that flies would be an airplane. A mobile office that floats in the water is a different type of animal. We have, I think, an obligation as an industry to sell careers in the shipping industry and be able to compete effectively, because if we don't do that, we're not necessarily going to get the best and brightest. And as Mark has pointed out, the automation that's going to come out is going to require skills from the neck up. And that's not just anyone. And these people have to have the confidence. And so where does the industry want to go? I mean, well, you know, we know that education is actually evolving to where we're talking about science, math, engineering, and the arts because of the ability and the need to communicate. So let's continue to influence that pipeline as early on as possible, working with a program we have is My Ship, My World, to be able to affect people and at the early age to say there is this shipping industry, particularly important for our country because we have over 1.5 million people being born every year and over 1 million people looking at the workforce. So we have an obligation to guide their thinking to say, hey, there's an industry that can make a difference. And then we work with certain educational institutions to be able to mind shape these people, because we need the best and brightest if we want to make a difference. We can't take that for granted. We can't just assume that people can just be recruited from anyone. That's the pipeline for the long term. But there's an equal problem today. How do we transform the people who are on board who may not have had the quality education in the first place? How do we transform them to allow them to compete effectively? This is going to be another exercise where, as was suggested by both Mark and Parani, we've got to invest in their continuous development. And they don't have to be the most technically savvy, but they have to be able to either say no or raise a flag and say, look, I don't have the answer. Sure, guys, please send me somebody who will help me, because that's leadership, to be able to know what you know and what you don't know. And we need to take care of the people on board the ship as much as taking care of that pipeline. So at the end of the day, a shipping company has to be first and foremost a human resource development company too. And that platform has to be invested in. And so cost cannot just be a consideration. We're looking at investing in people as an important element, the tonnage providers, to ensure that the tonnage enablers, to ensure that the tonnage that's out there isn't going to necessarily fall into the same situation as the Ever Given, if we can avoid it.
Parani, your thoughts on best practice and lessons to be learned?
Yes, actually, I want to address the part of the question where you asked what are other industries doing and which sectors we can learn from. So I think one of the sectors where they invest heavily on leadership skills are the military. I think they invest a lot because they have selected the people and the stakes are high, and they need their leaders on the ground or sea or air to be agile, responsive, resilient. So they train, I think their people, I think if we compare all the other organizations, I think that's where a lot of training happens. Then, of course, the other corporate organization, there is some leadership training, but that's at a very high level. But I think the maritime industry is also quite sophisticated. I think we can do a self-analysis and see, how in this context that we operate in, how we can improve the leadership skills. And of course, we need to invest time and money and personal engagement, being role models ourselves. So we need to invest, let's say, in a more intentional way to develop the leaders of the future.
Yeah, but just I have one, let's say, reservation about what you said. Reservation in terms of cost issues. Shipping is a cost-sensitive industry because we are a global industry, meaning we have certain pressures are applied worldwide. So we have a budget. I'm not saying what the budget, but everyone has some sort of budget. And in the military and in these organizations, they don't have a budget. They do train because reliability is their number one. And I can point out the differences between the design of a commercial ship and the design of a naval ship. In a naval ship, you have reliability and survivability as the first, principle. They have separate engine rooms. They have double of everything. Why? Because the ship has to stay afloat and fight. But in commercial, ships, they have another design. It's one engine room, one of everything, and so on and so forth. So what about the cost issue?
Okay. Yeah, forgive me if I give a very simplified answer, but I'll expand on it. So, like we say, if you think the train is expensive, try having an accident.
No, I'm not saying that training is expensive. I'm just saying we have to learn from others, yes, but in real life terms, we have to learn from others in a practical way. This is what I'm just saying. I fully agree with you that training is not expensive. You have to invest wisely because I can also fully agree with what Dito says over a number of years. It's not something new. He's repeating that in many different ways. People have to think that the ship manager is a human resource organization. They have to develop the human resources. And this is where we stand today. Okay, that was not the case 20 years ago. I'm just saying the practical term. We have to bear in mind there are some cost constraints at the same time. So that's it. And in our industry, one of the disadvantages we have within the industry, we're not like the oil and gas or the offshore. We don't offer contracts like one year, 2 year lengthy contracts. We have a contract with a voyage or in a short period of time, and then you don't have anything. You might stay working with the same ship operator for 30 years, but you don't have one contract. You have as many contracts as the ships that you sell to the ship. So that's an internal, let's say, I'm not saying it's a disadvantage, an internal issue of the industry, because people tend to think, yes, I will invest into this, but how about if these people are gonna leave my organization? Then I have to go and invest into the new ones. So that's real life constraints I hear from many people within the industry. Just saying that, okay, as a counter argument. I don't disagree with you. That's the counter argument. Mark, your thoughts on how should we learn from other industries, maybe, or learn from our past? What do you think on how we develop these leaders?
Well, firstly, we could learn from the motor industry about designing ergonomically sound ships, both on the bridge and in the engine room. Because if we allowed the people who design ships' bridges to design a car, we'd have the steering wheel in the back seat and the pedals on the other side at the front, etc. It's that bad, and it is so simple to resolve. So we can learn from them. And when you make a nice workplace, you'll tend to people will work better, and they will avoid a lot more accidents. We can learn from the catering industry, where we have these hazard control points. We can study things in a little bit more detail and say, this moment in time during an activity is the critical point. We need to focus on that. We can learn from the rail industries. They do really in-depth incident investigations, and ours need to be more detailed and concise. The container industry could learn from the cruise industry by fitting stabilizers, and then maybe we're not going to start spilling boxes into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. What would the cost be of that compared to the loss of the we've seen recently? We can learn from the medical fraternity. You notice that every time surgeons go into surgery, they wear a face mask, so they do not infect other people. Society at large needs to study that practice and then shut up a bit about wearing masks. That's why they are so necessary, so that we can learn from everywhere, not just ourselves.
Okay. Now we have to wrap up the panel, and we have to wrap up this very interesting discussion. I would like to ask you one last question to, let's say, as a final remark. So I would like to ask you if you could change one thing that would have either an immediate or a profound, let's say, impact to boost, let's say, the development of maritime leaders. You have to select one thing. What could it be, that thing, and why? Just an example, just an idea. You can pick up anything. Someone might pick, let's say, I said earlier on, contracts in the range of 1 year or 2 years. That would make easier for people to see that. Mark pointed out, you may have better design of ships, so it's easier to attract people. It could be, anything. You name it, it's going to be there. So what's your take? If you could change one thing, what would it be and why? Dito.
It would be all of the above. I mean, if you take what Mark has suggested, we need to take a time out, take a step back and say, how do we rethink the next generation of ships? And in my mind, if we want to take things quickly, because we have no choice, the ships are going to continue to sail, perhaps we need to give a bigger voice to the crew themselves, who are operating in different conditions under different situations, and understand what are their challenges. Because oftentimes they'll tell you, if we ask them, how could you do it better? How could you do it more efficiently? And maybe their perspective is very manual in the absence of automation. But if we listen to that and we work with the experts, perhaps that's the first level of re-engineering some automation to help improve existing vessels. Because the reality is that these vessels aren't going to go away. And we take that back in terms of how we can train the next generations into that pipeline, so we don't we get away from how the rest of them have been coming out the door from whatever academic institutions. I find that also to be of interest, because every year there is a discussion between ship owners, shipbuilders, and class societies to talk about the next generation vessels. But you never hear of the ship managers and the crew managers and the crew themselves being part of that discussion. For example, we keep fitting so many things into the engine room. Have we ever talked about the ergonomics of the engine room in order to ensure that we can get more engineers to go down there? And how do we make sure that their working environment will be such that they're willing to stay down there, they're not going to get kidney stones, and we can attract. I mean, the reality is we don't get as many engineers because the work condition isn't good. But if we begin to bring some of these people into some of the discussions, perhaps we can work out short-term solutions to buy us time while we filter all of this back, because the reality is we're a moving mega ship, and it's very, very hard to turn. And everything is easy if we just keep following. But the challenge is that we're just doing more of the same and not getting out of the rut. And as more complexity occurs, as things like, for example, you know how an airplane, you now have these anti-shear warnings when you come into an area of turbulence. Well, perhaps you need that in the Suez Canal, where some of these warnings, if they are indeed, after the root cause analysis of the Ever Given, talk about storms, maybe that will affect your navigation and you don't just keep going through. So there's a combination of these things, and perhaps asking the people on the vessels who have been exposed to different challenging situations might be a quick step to be able to resolve some of the issues that we see. But I go back again, at the end of the day, industry academic linkages and creating an image of, as what Parani and Mark have said, of the role model of a future global maritime professional is very, very important. So we can attract the best and brightest into this industry and know that we are moving the world.
Yeah. Parani, your thoughts?
Yes, actually, I'd like to also address what you mentioned earlier, Apostolos, about the costs and how do we bring it into the leadership. It doesn't have to be expensive. You know, many of these things, you know, not to look at leadership training as, okay, we pay us a certain dollars and send the crew to a leadership training. No, that's not entirely what I'm referring to. It's in the way we look at the whole philosophy, starting with us and our behavior. You know, and this kind of ties in with what Dito and Mark said earlier. So let's say, for example, the technical manager in the office or the managing director, the way he interacts with the technical superintendent will influence the way the technical superintendent interacts with the master and the chief engineer, and so on and so forth. So the ideal leadership has to start from the top and it passes down. And that's how, you know, there is a culture of psychological safety for the ship in which they can operate and they can take decisions. They're not afraid to say, no, stop work, or, you know, we abort. They're not afraid to do that. And that decision making is key to leadership. And we need a similar kind of thought process, whether it is the yard in building ergonomic ships, or, you know, or similar kind of thing. But it's so if we have to change one thing, is the way, right from the office, the way we think about leadership and the way we practice leadership. That is, I think, a low-hanging fruit that we can all start with.
Mark, your thoughts?
In the word respect, we need to demonstrate the respect is really reaching all the seafarers so that they are encouraged to progress to masters and chief engineers, the leaders at sea, that their efforts are being recognized. And the only way I really see that happen is that all the people signing up to the, was it Neptune Accord? They sign up with their checkbooks as well, and we get this sort of worldwide public report out on BBC World or CNN, not just a short clip, but something at least 2 minutes explaining how all the goods are moved around the world and who is doing it. That's the only way I see forward. Otherwise, people, if somebody asked me, would I encourage somebody to go to sea after what has happened in the last 12 months, I would say, you're better off driving a white van. Seriously.
Yeah.
Something has got to change fundamentally.
It was a nice, fantastic actually video by BIMCO, but produced I think a couple of months ago about what you said, the image of shipping, etc. But I don't think it's properly promoted across the conventional media across the globe. Yeah, but I understand what you're saying. I would like
it's Mr. and Mrs. Average sat at home. Yeah. Need to appreciate this. Not all our organizations, and we pat ourselves on what a great job we did, but nothing materially has changed. That is the problem. I think
I'll say it because it's as we have to wrap up. I think we have a leadership problem with the industry. It's not something that we can change from one day to the other.
Yeah.
Tremendous amount of effort to change the image of shipping to Mr. and Mrs. Average, you said, sitting in their homes and they don't understand what they're doing, etc. But you see people complaining if they don't get their new toy out of China because the ship is stuck in the Suez Canal. They don't understand the value of it. And we as an industry, from the other side, we don't help them to realize that. But that's another discussion, that's another story. Because we think, talking about leadership today, we may have a leadership problem as an industry, as a whole. I mean, that's something much, much bigger to what we discuss. But what you said, it does make sense about taking the message to Mr. and Mrs. Average. Absolutely. I would like to thank you for your time. I would like to thank you for joining us. I would like to thank all our viewers and trust we see you one of our future talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Papo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dito.
Thank you.
Parani.
Bye.
Yeah.